So today I'm talking with Dil Green, who's a member of the lowimpact.org co-op. He used to be an architect and was a founder member of Brixton Letts and is now on the team of the building the UK Mutual Credit Network. So Dil, tell us a bit more about what you've been up to and how you got to this point.
Okay. So yeah, as you said, I have been an architect, sort of. I started studying it donkey's years ago. I've been a working architect until a couple of years ago, about 30 years experience. And in the course of that, in the course of my studies and then all the way through my practice, I came across a chap called Christopher Alexander, who had invented a technique called pattern languages, initially for addressing architectural design, but I fairly quickly realized that it was a brilliant tool for helping us poor humans map and approach design problems in all sorts of complex systems areas, of which finance is and human economics is obviously one. So that work all the way through that was pushing me towards getting better at understanding systems dynamics, complex systems interactions, and I was always very interested in that. I'd always been fairly alternative. Was a founder member of a housing co-op 30 years ago, which didn't go anywhere, and a founder member of another co-op called Brixton Common Land in the late 90s, which aimed to try and offset gentrification in Brixton. Hasn't really succeeded, but does still exist and does own a building. So that thread was always present in my thinking. And then a couple of 3 years ago, I began to be pretty clear that the coming sort of emergency, climate emergency, probably financial emergency, slow crash, was coming too quickly for architectural work, no matter how wonderful, to be really able to change anything. I mean, I was building eco buildings, but the number of buildings that I was going to get done in the next 10 years weren't going to amount to a hill of beans. So I began to think seriously about spending the next few years of my productive life at a deeper systemic level, really focusing on skills and capabilities I had that could be applied at the deepest possible level. And after some looking around, I've got some tech skills, I've got some sort of interest in various philosophical areas and things like that. It seems pretty clear to me that economic and financial systems are at the root of an awful lot of things that are going wrong at the moment. And that, from working in the Brixton Letts scheme 20 odd years ago and doing Matthew Slater's Money and Society MOOC and reading fairly widely, I began to think that there was definitely work to be done there, and mutual credit was definitely a key plank of that work.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. How do we build this new economy that's required, and using mutual credit as an exchange mechanism, and using the viable system model as a governance system. I've worked in the environment field for 25 years, and we have to stop damaging nature, otherwise the future's going to hold some horrors for humanity. Nature keeps us alive and healthy, we can't stop damaging nature as long as we have an economy that's predicated on constantly increasing consumption. So we
Yep.
need a new kind of economy, but how are we going to achieve that? The parliamentary route? Can we vote for a different economy? And if not, what? Violent revolution? Divine intervention? Nothing's looking likely. So how?
Right. Yeah, I agree with you that reformism is probably going to be too slow, that violence is too risky. Most they often ends up with unintended consequences of a fairly unpleasant kind.
Mhm.
And well, divine intervention would be lovely, but I'm not going to hold my breath. He didn't step in. It's Holocaust Day today. He didn't step in to stop the murder in the concentration camps. So
Mhm.
maybe he's had enough of us.
Yeah.
So I think it's up to us. So on the other hand, urgent change is really needed. You know, we can't hang about. So again, as I said before, what I'm looking for at the moment is the deepest systemic level at which it seems I have capacity to do something useful. There's a woman called Donella Meadows. We could put a link in the details.
Yeah,
Who?
everything we talk about, I'll put a link in the description.
Great. Okay. So she was part of the Club of Rome that wrote the original Limits to Growth report in the early 70s and carried on doing that sort of work for the rest of her life, thinking about systems, dynamic system change, complex systems, and sustainability. And she's written this really good paper, which, and it's in Wikipedia as well, which just sets out the various different layers of a system in which you can hope to interact, starting with really simple things like changing your own lifestyle. And then the deepest thing is change the culture. And so looking at, as I say, my capacities and where we're at, it seems to me again and again that the structural dynamics around the creation of money and are absolutely conditioning at a very deep level just about everything that this industrialized, now pretty much global civilization can do. And from my experience with Let's and then learning later on, it's evident that smart people have come up with other ways of structuring and making the rules of a means of exchange system that are just as capable of supporting a complex economy, long supply chains, fancy stuff like the computers and the technology that we're using to record and disseminate this interview, without requiring endless growth just to service debt, and therefore without implying capitalism and extractive, non-sustainable modes of production.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to me to be something well worth spending time on. And because it's, if we can make mutual credit a viable complementary alternative, at least at the first stage, for many people to spend some or all of their time in, that just by itself will change the nature of their economic relation to consumption.
Mm-hmm. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sort of interested in talking about how we federate the non-extractive economy rather than growing big institutions. Keep the institutions relatively small and federate them. So what have been the problems associated with trying to scale up using federation? Why have attempts at federation failed?
Well, if you think about it, the sorts of economy we want to become the norm are ones which are sustainable. And a great part of being sustainable is living within your means, not continually growing for the sake of growth. So when people set up co-ops or mutual credit networks or other sorts of non-extractive value creation systems, whether they're economic or whether they're gift economies or whatever, by their nature, they don't grow rapaciously. They don't have a strong need to grow. When they get big enough, they slow down. And that's exactly what we want to see. We want people to have enough to live decently, but not feel the need to accumulate more and more and more. So that's great. We want to build these systems, but the problem is that capitalism, and that isn't necessarily just fat cat capitalism, Chinese capitalism, Russian capitalism, state capitalism, just the system of industrial economy based on this debt-based scarce money that we've all been living with for hundreds of years, is growing faster and faster. It's growing at an exponential rate. And really the internet and West Coast America venture capitalist culture has sort of lit the blue touch paper, and the rate of growth, the rate of expansion is just spiraling out of control. So we have a real growth problem, and we have a problem in reining that in with these non-extractive economic modes we want to replace them with, because those don't grow fast. So this is where this word federation comes in. What we want is not a growth of scale, but a growth of impact, a growth of involvement. We want the sector that is non-extractive to grow really, really super fast, and for people to actively want to step out of the extractive capitalist rat race sector and into this non-extractive sector. So if we can get millions, within, some reasonable length of time, a couple of decades, billions of people to be getting their subsistence, at least from non-extractive sustainable economies, then that sector has to grow really fast. But it depends on trust, really, and human scale. And so it's got to grow as a network of human-size organizations. It can't be, 2 billion people on Facebook. That's just not a human-scale organization. So this idea of federation, this idea of many, many human-scale organizations being able to interact with each other using modern technology, using sophisticated communications and management techniques and all this sort of stuff, to be able to produce, again, things like computers, mobile phones, high-tech medical equipment, so that we can have a decent standard of living. Those are very complex supply chains, complex industrial processes. All of those things need to be somehow replicated without the huge machinery of capitalism. So federation, wise and effective interaction, has to be the way forward.
So how might basing that federation on a mutual credit exchange system and a viable system model governance system, how does that kind of approach work?
Well, okay, so let's leave mutual credit to one side for a bit and talk about this VSM thing, because I know you've done an interview with Trevor Hilder, who I know fairly well. So VSM
link in the description.
Yeah, VSM stands for Viable System Model. It's a fairly nerdy sort of technical subject, really, but what it really comes down to is a much more thoughtful and adaptable management model for human institutions, for any system really, than the straightforward management and workers top-down hierarchical model which we've sort of inherited from the early 19th century, and which is very sort of crude. We tend to sort of split people into workers and bosses, and that's all there is. The viable system model is wiser than that, and it says, well, organizations have to have different modes of operation to be able to persist in their environment and work effectively. So there is, of course, production, people actually doing things. Then there's coordination. Different sets of people doing things need to be able to work in harmony to produce effectively and without waste. Then, of course, there is a sort of command and control function there, which communicates to various productive teams what ought to be done next and makes sure that standards and things like that are working. But as well as those three modes, which we might understand, it introduces two other modes, one of which is it calls guardianship. And that's about really keeping a very clear eye on the reason that we're all engaged in whatever the system is doing in the first place. So, you know, what is our purpose? Why are we doing this? And making sure that short-term goals or environmental buffeting or just inattention don't let us go astray, and something which we'd set out thinking was really great might end up just existing for the sake of existing, or existing to make someone rich or something, almost by mistake. So there's a sort of guardianship function that organizations need. And then there's another function which is sometimes called sort of future and forward. It's basically the research, the sort of sitting back and looking at the wider context and making sure that surprises, new information from the environment are understood and incorporated into the action of the organization in a timely way.
And I want to ask specifically how the viable system model works together with mutual credit to try and bring about this federation of the non-extractive sector.
So for me, that BSM model and mutual credit need to sort of also be considered almost fused together through this thing that lots of people would have heard of, which is a sort of multi-stakeholder cooperative approach, where what you do is you look at all the various different players in the system and you acknowledge that they may have different, as it were, value propositions. You know, the reason they're there are different. And you try and design the functioning of the organization and the governance of the organization so that those different stakeholder groups all can interact together. All of them will need the organization to achieve its purpose to succeed, and they need all the other groups to succeed.
Sorry, talking about the federation itself is an entity which is a multi-stakeholder co-op.
what you have, and this is again another key aspect of the viable system build, is at every level of the system you have the same type of structural thinking. So you have, the technical term is recursion. So within a small work team of 5 people, you might have someone whose job it is to remember, what our purpose is here, and or spend some time doing that. You might, but then when 3 or 4 of those groups come together, you need to have a wider version of all those systems. So if you think of a federation of mutual credit networks, which is what we're talking about, so in order to be able to intertrade between networks, they all have to have access to some accounting system, some trade verification system, some business directory. Who maintains that? Well, that will be a sort of specialist set of people, stakeholders. They'll maintain software and deal with, maybe handing records to the government at year end and that sort of thing on behalf of all the members. So they aren't the same as an ordinary member who just trades. So you get these different stakeholders, and you get those at all the levels of scale. So you might have a little local neighborhood mutual credit, which would be more like a let scheme that people might know, where you might just trade DIY tools and surplus produce. But then several of those might be joined into a regional, a town-sized network with shops and businesses in, and then several towns might be grouped together in a regional network. And at all levels of this federation, you've got these different stakeholders, and there'll be, people who are investors. These things will need money to get started in the environment we're in. They have very different value propositions from members, and we need to align all these people very carefully.
But there'll be some things that we can't get from the non-extractive sector yet, like laptops or cars. What do we do then? Just suck it up and do the best we can until we can get them from the non-extractive sector.
There isn't really anything else we can do. I mean, at the moment in the UK, all pretty much the electrical power is generated by huge, international businesses. We aren't going to change that overnight. So we're always going to be, for, at least the first couple of phases of building this new economy, in a mixed economy where we're, holding our noses and doing business with organizations that, we think are probably on balance destructive, but we have to live. The key for me will be making it as easy as possible at every stage for the next target sort of group of traditional businesses to be able to transition into mutual credit, either fully or partially as they go along. I've been thinking about this with banks. Banks are closing branches all over the country, and one reason they're trying to do this is they really would love to have no cash. They would love to have a cashless society because it's very cheap for them to run that. They could sack, huge proportion of their staff and just run everything with computers and a few hundred people at head office if everyone was using smart cards to pay for everything. But actually, that's a two-edged sword for them, because mutual credit works purely on information. It doesn't have physical tokens of cash. So actually, once the banks implement those systems, then at a certain level of scale, then we just say to them, well, start becoming services of mutual credit. You won't earn interest. You'll have to earn your money doing something else. But, here's mutual credit's coming thing. So those sort of things, I think, are, fun to think about now, not very seriously. But in the future, that'll be the way to think.
So I guess a non-extractive economy will involve co-ops of various descriptions and sole traders, public sector workers. Anything else?
Co-ops are the obvious place to start. There's all sorts of great things about working with co-ops. I mean, beyond the reasons we might think we like co-ops, co-ops have immediate access to individuals because all of the workers in a co-op are members of a co-op. So we're planning to start this UK Mutual Credit Network as a business-to-business network, but to expand throughout the economy, it needs to be able to serve individuals, and the individuals within a co-op that's already in the mutual credit network will be a great place to start. At the other end of the spectrum, the co-ops movement already has access to government. You know, it can go and talk to government and tell it what we need. So co-op sector is great. The public sector is another brilliant target that I think, you know, we'd be looking at, you know, a lot sooner than we'd be looking at, you know, energy generation companies and things like that, because most of the work that local authorities do is labor power. You know, they employ local people to deliver local services. Well, that's basically tailor-made for mutual credit. And in an era of austerity, and even if the floodgates of cash are opened, it's still going to take 10 to 15 years for lots of local authorities to build their services back up to where they were in 2010. So mutual credit networks can massively leverage the power of local authorities to do great work. So then sole traders, they're basically, you know, individuals on steroids, really, I suppose. And they're, you know, probably the main issues there will be sort of annoying ones about regulatory status of whether this counts as consumer credit, and really, you know, just things that are far too detailed at the moment. Yeah. So for sure, all of those sectors should be folded in within, you know, a reasonable timescale. And once you get local authorities, and then maybe you would next look to hospitals, then suddenly you have turned a huge corner, because those organizations employ tens, hundreds of thousands. I think the NHS possibly employs over 1 million people. And once a few of those employers realize what they can do with mutual credit, how it completely unlocks the constraints of scarce money in delivering the services that they, by and large, you know, strongly believe in as a social good that they want to deliver, that will be enormous.
And how do we keep the individual units of this new economy small, and federate them rather than allow? I'm thinking of the co-op bank. Obviously, it got enormous, stumbled, fell over, got swallowed by a hedge fund. It was gone, and suddenly there was no cooperative bank in the country. And if it was a federation of small local cooperative banks, then if part of it fell over and got bought out, then we'd still have the rest of the federation. How do we keep the unit small?
Well, probably constant vigilance. On the other hand, it seems clear to me that mutual credit, at least to start with, is going to be less economically useful than the pound in your pocket. Pound in your pocket can be spent on anything that's for sale in this country, but a mutual credit network that's starting out with only few thousand members will only be able to be spent on things that those few thousand members can provide, and that's going to be limited. So as a purely economic means of exchange, it's not going to be as good as pounds for some time to come. So what makes it better? We have to look to things that aren't purely economic, and those are trust, community, solidarity, and those things, turns out, are actually economically useful as well. You know, you'll give more credit into a network where you know that a majority of the members there are people that you've sort of met or that you understand their ethos, than you would to an anonymous internet sort of mutual lending corporation or something like that. So I think there will be a natural tendency for these networks not to grow. As I've said before, you know, the whole nature of non-extractive economics is that people tend to grow until they're happy and then just stop. Whereas businesses usually grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And
well, they have to keep increasing returns to their shareholders, don't they?
Yeah. And also because they're in a competitive environment, even if you might start a cafe and think after a couple of years, oh, this is great, we'll just run this cafe until I retire. This is lovely. I make a decent living and I like my customers. Suddenly next door there's a Cafe Nero on one side and a Starbucks 3 doors up, and your business goes. So people feel that they have to grow even if they don't want to in the capitalist sector. So we need to leverage this social side of the mutual credit networks, and that will tend to limit their scale of individual networks. People will like to be in networks where they know they can trust people, and that will give them a value which adds to the pure economic value of the currency units that you get.
Adds to the quality of life.
Just a little anecdote about that. Bricks and Let scheme, I was active in that for 4 years or so. Effectively, for me, it stopped being a viable organization, after about a couple of years after that. And that was all. So that was nearly 20 years ago since I've been an active member of Bricks and Lets. It's, not a thing. But the acquaintances that I made through the not particularly sort of economically powerful trading that I did over those years have lasted me 20 years. And I now, I'm knitted into the fabric of Brixton. I have this great network of acquaintances who I can see, and I don't have to say, oh my gosh, we haven't seen each other for so long. We must ring. We must go to the pub more often, like you do with friends, and you know that neither of you are really going to do it. These are straight acquaintances. You can just say, hi, haven't seen you for a few years. How are you doing? I'm doing okay. Yeah, kids growing up. See ya. And you're just happy that they're there. It's a really massive thing, I think, in modern society.
Yeah. What will be the biggest barriers to this kind of approach, do you think? And how might we overcome them or get around them?
Lots of barriers. The biggest one, I think, of course, is the stuff inside people's heads. We've had hundreds of years in the West of scarcity-based money, debt-based money, monopoly-controlled money, commodity ideas about money. And those things have worked their way into the culture. Sort of famous quotes from Dickens, they're just part of the way we grow up, is thinking about how money has always worked. And when you say to people, it doesn't have to work like that, they quite often sort of get a bit leery, basically. Someone comes up to you and says, oh, I know more about money than you do. You should join in with this new scheme I've got. It'll make you rich. Mostly you think, here's someone talking about something I don't really understand. They say they know more about money than I do, and they want me to invest time or effort into it. I think I'm going to get ripped off here. That's a standard response that people might have, So we're going to have to develop a lot of sort of soft culture around what mutual credit is.
Yeah, so maybe we need more accessible information and videos and talks and books and blog articles,
games, stories. cartoons, comics, films, all sorts of, it's going to take probably hundreds of years for some of the deeply ingrained feelings about money that this culture has got to work themselves through.
Mm-hmm.
But
and also, I mean, the extractive sector are going to want to keep extracting, and they have quite a lot of power. What's to stop them buying up parts of the federation or leaning on governments to legislate against us?
Okay, so number one, we have to craft our legal constitutions and checks and balances and governance agreements really carefully. That's crucial, so that what happened to the building societies can't happen to us. So we have to put these sort of poison pills into our constitutions that make it just not worth the bother for financializing institutions to come and try and rip the value out of the networks. As to legislation stacking the decks against us, that's sort of bound to happen. I mean, if you look at the history of all the sort of mutual solidarity financial institutions that working classes have built, building societies, mutual assurance societies, even the all sorts of things that the poor and disadvantaged tend to group together and build some sort of mutual solidarity schemes. Any of those that become successful tend to attract lots and lots of legislation, which is framed as, oh, well, there have been some failures in this sector and some people have lost their savings. So, of course, we've got to now oh, well, yes, you can run a mutual bank, but you've got to have £20 million in the bank as collateral before you can open it. So have you got £20 million? Oh, well, you'll have to shut down then. That sort of thing, sort of bound to happen. So what we have to do, I think, is to frame the legal structures of our organizations as closely as possible to existing organizations, so that if they try and legislate us out of existence, they'll also be legislating traditional businesses out of existence. And, that sounds a bit slick, but that's basically, a really clear strategy.
Mm-hmm. And where do the resources come from to make this happen?
So we sort of have to build this out of thin air. What we're doing is we're saying we're building a sector which will not produce massive profits. It's a non-extractive sector. So that means it's hard to get the sort of investment you might think of for building another sort of business to come in. However, there are some very smart people around, and a chap called Chris Cook, who's on our sort of advisory panel, has come up with this particular approach which allows investors to get a fixed rate of return, and only on the basis that the project succeeds. So there will be a vehicle for patient investors who share the same analysis that we do of impending, slow crashes in the environment and the financial system, and who want to build resilience against that, to make, hard cash investment that will repay them decently in hard cash terms as the mutual credit system expands. And I think we can design legal and financial systems that will make those investments attractive enough and safe in terms of not giving away control or ownership to people who are only putting in cash.
Do you honestly think that there's widespread support for a movement like this?
No, I don't think that you could call it widespread. I think there's I think the door is there to be pushed open among progressive financial circles, progressive economists, and people like Positive Money, Good Money, Rethinking Economics, New Economics Foundation, Kate Raworth's Donut Economics people. There's a lot of new oxygen around economics for non-orthodox approaches. There's an amazing woman called Stephanie Kelton in America who's pushing modern monetary theory ideas, which are sort of halfway towards mutual credit, to be honest, into very right-wing business people and getting actually quite strong receptions. So I don't think that the general public or even the general chief financial officer in business circles has any real clue what mutual credit is. But I think the chances of us getting good support and constructive engagement with the financial, progressive financial and progressive economics communities are pretty high. And that, I think, will lead to some investment and probably to some regulatory simplification. If we get support from those sort of types talking to government, that should help. So, yeah, to be honest, I think widespread support isn't going to come until people meet their friends who say, oh, yeah, my firm's doing this weird, funny money stuff, but you know what? It's working. It's going to be not so much support as people voting with their feet when they hear their friends, their, people down the golf club saying, well, yeah, I joined this scheme and, my turnover's going up and my debt payments are going down. So give it a go.
I guess it'll grow when it's established and it's easy to join, I suppose.
So the problem with all those things is it's always chicken and egg. How do you get there from here? So we're going to have to start with enthusiasts, with people who really want it to work, with people who share our analysis. And we're going to have to plow through a couple of 3 years of fine-tuning things, pump priming, building networks, refining the software, the accounting, all those things to make it as easy as possible to use. And that's why I think we need to be thinking seriously about raising finance to get us through those periods. We can't do it in a pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, doesn't matter if it takes 20 years modality, because capitalism's growing too far and too fast and the climate's collapsing too fast and too far. I
guess if it works, I guess it will have been quite exciting to have been an early adopter.
For sure. Being an early adopter is always an interesting thing. You sort of, there are ups and downs to being an early adopter, but the designs that we're thinking of and the ways that we're thinking of allowing and encouraging businesses to participate in the mutual credit network are carefully structured to avoid anybody getting seriously burned.
Mm-hmm. And final question, really. Do you think we have enough time?
Doesn't matter. We got to do it. It's the old transition town thing. Is transition thinking going to save the save our civilization? We don't know, but if we don't try, it definitely won't work. And if we do try and it fails, who do you want to have been working with? The people who've been building resilience, or the people who've been working to destroy stuff? I want to be with you guys.
Yeah.
Whatever happens.
Right then, Dil. Thanks ever so much for the chat.
Thank you.
And I'll speak to you again next week.
Okay. Cheers.
Cheers, then, Dil.
Yeah. Good night.